We're following a story out of Denver where a person in jail for 3 years facing murder charges was just released Wednesday. And I want to bring in investigator Brian Moss from Denver. Brian, you've been following this case for about 10 years. Could you just describe a little bit of the background for us before we get into this?
Sure. Andrew Graham was a graduate student at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and one night in 2009 he had gotten off a light rail, RT light rail here, and was walking home when he was gunned down, and investigators always thought that the motive on that was robbery. So that was in 2009. Nothing much really happened on that case for years. Finally, in 2016, though, 7 years after he was murdered, a grand jury here in Colorado indicted 4 people in connection with his death, all on felony murder charges and charges associated with his killing. And they were all jailed in early 2017. However, just last week, one of them, Kendall Austin, after nearly 3 years in jail, was released with prosecutors saying they simply didn't have enough evidence to prove the case and that they had an obligation to dismiss the case, which they did. So Kendall Austin walked out of jail after almost 3 years, a free man, saying via his lawyer that he always knew that day would come. He always knew that the truth would come out, in his words. There are still several other people who are facing these felony murder charges who have yet to go on trial.
And so what happens with those 3 people? Do they remain in jail today?
Yeah, you know, there are, one of them has already pleaded guilty and has agreed to testify against the other defendants. So now there are really just 2 of them left in jail, and they are scheduled to go to trial later this year. But again, Kendall Austin, one of the primary suspects in this, released as prosecutors said they simply lack the evidence to take his case to trial.
And Brian, do we know right now what's next for Kendall Austin? Will he face any sort of situation where he maybe sues for time spent in jail?
Yeah, great question, Katie. And I asked his attorney that. His attorney kind of didn't really want to answer that question about what they might do on the civil side of things. He said right now, Kendall Austin has a wife and a young child. He's getting reacquainted with them. He hopes to go back to work. He was a cook in a restaurant. He hopes to get his job back and resume his life that way. So that's kind of what's on the horizon for him right now. As far as other legal action down the road, that could come, but there's nothing firm on that at this point.
Brian, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you think is important to touch on in this case?
You know, one of the really interesting pieces on this, Katie, is these 4 people were in jail. Kendall Austin's now been released. One of them pled already and is going to testify against the others. So you have 2 left. But those are 2 people who investigators say were present for the crime. The person who they actually think was the shooter, the gunman, has never been arrested or charged in this case. What they were apparently doing was trying to put the pressure on these other defendants who they thought were present for this murder to get them to testify against the suspected shooter, who again has never been arrested or charged. So that's kind of the contours of this case at this point.
And do police know who the suspected shooter is then?
They do. They have named him, but like I said, never have had enough to arrest him or charge him. I think what they were really hoping was if they could get these other defendants to flip on him and to testify against him, they thought that might be enough to eventually get a case against the suspected shooter of Andrew Graham, but they haven't gotten there yet.
All right, Brian, well, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us about this case today. Brian has been following this investigation for more than a decade now, and you can read even more about what has happened in it in the time since on CBS Denver's website. I'm Katie Johnston for CBSDenver.com.